feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled TIFF review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rorabeck, alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchen.
Matt, how are you? It's day 3 of the film festival. It's
Bright and
also
early.
September the 11th as we're recording this, the 20th anniversary of that tragic event in that day. We talked a lot about that on the review for Worth, which you can go back and watch or listen to. But we haven't forgotten, and I think it's also just important to
Acknowledge
it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. Day 3, we are running on, I hate it
Running on
sounds
empty, like Jackson
yeah.
Brown.
No, I hate being that person in like that kind of cliche of like, oh, but like that is part of the festival. Like I think the last 2 nights, 4 or 5 hours sleep each. But last night we did spend in Soho, everyone. So
I
yes,
see what you did there. I thought you
We're
were
t-
going to say last night a DJ saved my life,
yeah,
referring
sure.
to the song.
Right. No, I you know me with music. But yes, today we are reviewing Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. Eric and I went to kind of the premiere last night. It was at the same time as the premiere. We went to the press screening of it at TIFF Bell Lightbox, which I'm sure we'll get into a little bit, but God, I love that theater. So it is another world when you go there compared to most places. But yes, we are reviewing Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. We're covering the entirety of the 2021 Toronto International Film Festival. So if you want to get all of our reviews, head over to our YouTube channel, subscribe over there. Click that notification bell. You'll get all of our video reviews, or if you prefer an audio format, you can head over to the Untitled Movie Reviews podcast. Subscribe over there, and you'll get all of our TIFF content. We'll be having reviews for Dune. You can get our review for Spencer. We have tons of stuff up right now, and we'll have even more over the next week and a half. So it's a blast. But yes, today, Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. Eric, I know our hype levels we're both Edgar Wright fans. I think you a little bit more than me. But I think this is one of our most anticipated films of the festival.
Yeah, and especially considering Edgar Wright himself. We reviewed his first documentary earlier this year that played at Sundance and premiered at Sundance, the Sparks Brothers documentary about the band Sparks, Ron and Russell Mael. And as people
And
know,
also reviewed Annette, which features the Sparks Brothers, which this movie features,
which was written, that script and the music was written by the Sparks. Yeah,
and there's a marionette in this movie,
right.
Sort of.
So it all comes full circle. But going back to Wright himself, he is a fan of film, a proponent of watching movies in the cinema. He's also a genre aficionado when it comes to horror specifically, and with his breakout film Shaun of the Dead, that combined the horror comedy elements to kind of make this fun, over the top but still gory and respectful genre effort that kind of set him apart from other filmmakers in the early 2000s. And since then, he completed his Cornetto trilogy. He directed a film in Toronto with Scott Pilgrim versus the World. More recently, he directed the now somewhat problematic Baby Driver, based on a couple of the cast members. But another key aspect of who Wright is his love of music, and sort of incorporating soundtracks that are specific to him, and also the milieu of the period that's being depicted, or based on sort of the character expressing themselves from the inside
through
out.
Music,
yeah. And here with Last Night in Soho, talking about first, this is truly a horror film first and foremost, not a horror comedy. And he is very much paying homage to Giallo horror movies, films from Mario Bava and Dario Argento. You think of, obviously, the most obvious reference being Suspiria. When it comes to Giallo movies, there are key indicators of that in terms of signature style points, where you have saturated colors, breaking glass, close-ups of eyes, intense unsettling music, and usually a murder mystery that's fairly obvious to predict. And then on top of that, I mean, obviously, Giallo cinema is Italian based, so a lot of the North American releases, or English speaking releases of those films were dubbed. So like when you watch some of those movies and go back and see Bird with the Crystal Plumage, you see the dub not really syncing correctly, and that's kind of the charm of those movies now.
Mm-hmm.
And all those elements are incorporated in Last Night in Soho, which is a story about a young woman who aspires to be a fashion designer and moves from her rural home living with her grandmother to London. And when she gets there, she kind of sees the world in kind of those rose tinted glasses at first, but very quickly begins to realize that it's a very cruel and mean place, to the point where the dorm she's at and the people she's staying with are always partying. They don't care about what she's doing, and so she moves out to this kind of small little apartment run by the late great Diana Rigg, who a lot of people will remember from the TV series The Avengers, not the Marvel Avengers, and on Her Majesty's Secret Service with one and done Bond George Lazenby. And what she begins to realize is that her dreams might be a reality. And one of the traits of Ellie, played by Thomasin McKenzie, is that she loves everything to do with the 1960s. And nostalgia plays a very huge role in this film, as well as the sort of genre bending elements. Now, we're not going to spoil anything with this review. We're going to be respectful to Edgar Wright's wishes, and we would be even if he didn't post that Venice letter. But in the trailer there is a scene, or scenes, where we see Ellie basically inhabiting the life of a 60s starlet, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, Sandy, who also has aspirations, but her aspirations are to be a singer, and sort of maneuvering in the world and navigating through sort of a male dominated entertainment industry at the time. It's a movie that kind of plays tug of war with you, and I think we both feel this way, where
Yeah.
watching the film there are moments that are very much kinetic and filled with kind of a joyous reverence for the genre. And Wright is a filmmaker that is always fun to kind of watch his movies unfold. But then there's another part where we're going to have to be cryptic about it, but
Yeah.
the plot twists and turns, and we can say that at least, seem to be a little bit inconsistent. And then also they kind of play in this kind of category of, well, they want to have their cake and eat it too, and it just feels like it betrays some of the character beats of the
Yeah, I totally agree.
story.
Yeah, no, I'm completely with you. I think you summed it up quite perfectly there, Eric. But like, I'm kind of torn on the movie. I think I'm a little hit or miss with Edgar Wright. Like, I really like him as a person and as a filmmaker, and I'll always be interested in any movie that he makes. But the Cornetto trilogy, not really my thing. Obviously loved Scott Pilgrim at the time. I was the perfect age for it. We are from Toronto. I love video games. I read the comics, and that movie I love. And then Baby Driver, I thought was a pretty solid heist movie. And you know I think he does a pretty good job in this movie injecting himself and his style into that Giallo kind of formula. I think it's energetic. I think it's a ton of fun at times. I think it's exciting. The wall to wall music, I think, weirdly works, where I wouldn't expect like a horror movie or a Giallo movie like this to just have wall to wall kind of needle drops and it still be kind of creepy at times. And he, I mean, he plays with sound and music, like you mentioned, which is a trope of the genre as well. But yeah, I feel like the two lead performances are great. I love Thomas and Mackenzie. I love Anya Taylor-Joy. Like I thought the dual kind of role of them kind of mirroring each other, I think is cool. A lot of the imagery is stylish and beautiful and off-putting at times. I think it left me wanting more or something to be desired because like I feel like it just in that last act kind of falls apart a little bit. And I like the themes and what the movie is overall kind of trying to say or touch on. And we alluded to it a little bit, and I don't want to go too deep into it because it was something I think that was unexpected for me. Like, I don't know if I didn't think this movie was going to tackle certain subjects that it does. And I think it's kind of an interesting kind of way to go. Someone who fantasizes the past and leans into nostalgia a lot, and especially a time where they weren't alive. And you go, well, like for me and you, we were born in the 80s, Eric, but we, love
we
80s
we
movies. And
grew
we were
up
like,
in the 90s,
in the 90s,
right?
but then we kind of look at the 80s like this time where we weren't really living through, but we're like, oh, it seemed really fucking awesome. And I like the idea of taking that, and like you said, she doesn't like her situation she's at in the present day, with these people she doesn't feel like she connects with, so she wants to escape to this fake kind of reality she kind of almost creates, that's this view of the past in her head. And then when she gets an actual you know a kind of view into what actually took place then, and how how men treated women, and how the how problematic it was, and just kind of how people dealt. Like, I liked that kind of diving into those subjects, but then I also feel.
Even if it's simplified,
Yes,
like
so that's
it's
kind of what I was
surface
gonna say.
level.
Yeah, and like I just like that they touched on it. I wish they went a little bit further, and then I totally agree with you that it kind of betrays some of its characters in the final act, to the point where I think it's just trying to get one on you, or like kind of go, or like you said, it's kind of like a thing to be like, well, it's a mystery with kind of a twist, and I feel like the twist just doesn't really work. And then it kind of left me going, oh, like I don't believe it, like I don't kind of buy into, and then it takes you out of it. And then even so, I kind of ultimately was like, I had fun with it, and I think I ultimately enjoyed it because of its style. And I think Edgar Wright brings a lot of himself that you wouldn't think kind of would work in a format like this or a movie like this, because like you said, it is a horror movie first and foremost. It's not Shaun of the Dead, but like there are, classic Edgar Wright kind of one-liners or jokes that I think sometimes land and sometimes don't. There's, the kind of kinetic kind of whoosh, like editing kind of thing that you see a lot in Scott Pilgrim and Baby Driver and recent stuff, in all of his movies, really. Like and I wouldn't, again, I keep saying this, but like I didn't think that would work in a movie like this, but I found myself kind of going, oh, okay, like I like seeing Edgar Wright kind of put his spin on this. And yeah, ultimately I think it just doesn't quite stick the landing. But I'm kind of, I did enjoy myself, but I just wanted more.
Yeah, and what I think we all should talk about is that this film is co-written by Kirsty Wilson Cairns,
Yeah.
who wrote 1917, and Edgar Wright also has a story by credit here, so it is his idea, but he's collaborating with her to get the female perspective on the
Hmm.
story. And part of it feels like it's almost like a fail-safe situation, where it's like some of the stuff that we saw in this movie, if it were to be criticized by us, it would almost be like, oh well, we brought on a female consultant, a writer, to kind of
Right.
bring a perspective that otherwise wouldn't exist, because it might be then harder to maybe call Edgar Wright out on some of those last act sort of twists and turns and betrayals. And it
Yeah.
just kind of feels a little bit disingenuous almost. Not to say that, Karen's didn't do anything on the script, because
It's hard to
obviously
yeah.
she's a genre fan as well. So
Yeah, it's hard to say on that point, because I do agree with you, but like I feel like maybe I'd be curious to see kind of where the project started, and if it even involved some of these themes and things that we're talking about, or if that did come from Karen's. Like I'd be curious if it was more straight up, or if she came in and was like, hey, let's add another level onto this. And again, the movie doesn't necessarily, it's you know basically it's like, well, the classic saying of like, well, it was a different time back then, right? Like kind of excusing people's actions because it was in, men acted differently, and that's just kind of how it was back then. And I like the idea of saying no, fuck that, and kind of showcasing that in like in a genre, in genre ways. And like, I don't know if that was her who brought that in, or if it was Wright and then they brought in her to kind of, tweak it. That's hard to kind of say,
well,
but
also with
um
the sort of the underlining development of Ellie, Thomasin McKenzie's character, and it alluding to mental illness within the family, and
mhm.
having the first scene, having lost her mother, and sort of that slow decline into madness, and whether or not it's really happening. That's also a very delicate situation to handle in films in general, and then on top of that, especially when you're depicting it within you know the female psyche of those characters, because you don't want to just portray, especially if you're coming from a male point of view, of like creating a character that's just quote unquote hysterical, or you're gaslighting this character. You want to give Ellie some agency still, and not just betray her in order to make her a plot device or to
Yeah.
move the story along. And I think it is more successful there with handling some of that stuff, even if maybe some of the structure and, again, the last act don't always pay off, or you maybe question some of those decisions that are being made. Because I also think that it does take a really weird stance on sex workers in a weird way as well, that kind of just feels like, okay, like, I'm sure Edgar Wright isn't sort of condemning sex workers, but it just kind of feels like, almost like, there's this sort of evil side to that's just kind of
Mhm.
like, they just left it there, they left it hanging. um
No,
Another,
yeah, I agree with you
yeah,
there.
and,
Yeah.
and another thing I did actually really like in terms of casting Anya Taylor-Joy, I mentioned that Giallo has always been kind of interested in the eyes specifically.
Mhm.
She has such a captivating face that it's kind of
Yeah.
like a perfect actor to sort of have a close-up in a horror movie, to cause that additional anxiety and
Mhm.
stress, and you just remember, like, that face on the stage, and sort of the again, the old adage of, this town or this industry will chew you up and spit you out, and
Yeah.
how people change over time. Because when we first see her, and when Ellie's vicariously living through Sandy, she is plucky and determined, and knows what she wants, and knows where she wants to go in life. And then she meets Matt Smith's character, who on the surface level seems like a decent guy, or sets himself apart from the rest of these kind of men who are pigs and
Mhm.
jerks, and
This was long before he became Skynet.
yes, exactly. Or Doctor Who. Or maybe he was Doctor Who at this time. But even that's kind of interesting in terms of where
Yeah.
that character's dynamic goes. There's a moment where you see him hanging out with somebody later on, and it's almost like, talking about politics at the end of the day, all being on, at the same table. It's just when the cameras are on, they're, creating this
Mhm.
persona or posturing themselves as somebody else in order to, win another person over.
Yeah, and I
And
like
that's
what
kind of
you
interesting.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like what you brought up of like maybe like trying to make it in the arts, right? Like in performance and in whether it's film or music or fashion or something like that, and kind of that metaphor as well of like not comparing it, that I think sex work. I agree with you how it's portrayed in the movie, and I don't know if it's necessarily comparing like working in the arts to like selling yourself, selling sex and stuff like that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I think it's interesting of, the predatory men in the film and like how they kind of take advantage of you that could allude to, working in the arts and how it's kind of portrayed in the movie. I think there's something interesting there, but going back to it, I just never know if it's explored enough to kind of really have like something meaty to say.
Yeah, there's
Um,
more here than there is in a lot of Giallo films, because Giallo movies,
sure.
like, are they truly
Kind of
the,
pretty shallow,
well,
yeah.
they're the, style over
Yeah.
substance. And
And there's a
usually a
lot of
lot.
style here, and it is style over substance, but there is, like, a little bit there at least.
Yeah, and even though there's no dubbing in this movie, you could almost argue that the dubbing is having
Yeah.
Ellie, basically sharing this kind of avatar kind of type character and mirroring
And yeah,
her
it
in a
always
way.
shows her through mirrors and things like that. And we talked about this on the way home where you brought up that really interesting point where and I thought the dubbing, because in the dubbing it's always a little bit off, right? And
Yeah.
I thought like even in the way that she was mirroring how Ellie was mirroring Sandy, like I thought it was interesting that it was always a little off, right? Like it wasn't completely in sync. And then that is a testament how Edgar Wright shot the movie too. Like he'd have to shoot the scenes, the same exact scene. And I just kind of like that it was off kilter a little bit and a little bit off. And I just thought the editing was very smooth there as well to kind of showcase that and how certain shots would transition between the two actresses. And again, it's hella stylish, and that's kind of Edgar Wright's thing, right? Like I mean, and I think it's not for everyone, but
And
I
he's
think
working with a really wonderful cinematographer
cinematographer, yeah.
with Chung Hoon Chung, who shot the adaptation of Stephen King's It,
Mhm.
the recent one, and then also is Park Chan Wook's regular cinematographer. And then another thing that I want to say that I actually really did like about the script that I feel a lot of people will complain about is it doesn't over explain the time travel paradox
Yeah.
of it all. And I feel like that is something where like a mainstream audience member or some criticism will be, well, like, oh, I need to know the minutia or how like this all works. And I kind of, it's just like, okay, just go with it. Like, just,
Well, I
you
think
don't
it
need
goes
to get
back. Yeah.
into it too deeply because it's
And
basically dreamlike.
yeah, and I totally agree with you. And I think when you said about talked about how the movie depicts mental health and things like that, I think it's more so how the characters in the movie are perceiving her abilities as, mental health issues when, obviously the movie is saying that her abilities are like real, where like she sees her mother, in the mirror at the beginning of the movie, and you can kind of see that she almost can, take a view into the past or into other people's kind of histories and things like that. And I think I think that's enough explanation for me, and I don't think that's spoiling anything. That it's
Yeah.
just like
But I can see some
um
people having a problem with that where it's like, oh, I don't
oh, she
understand.
just goes to bed and then starts doing this, and you don't really understand how she can kind of get a view into what actually happened
Yeah.
in the 60s. Yeah, I totally I get that, but to me that was enough through just the little bit at the beginning with the mom that I kind of was like, "Oh, she's either done this before or she even the stuff
She
with her
has almost like a
mom like
sixth sense, right?
yes.
Where like
Yeah.
she's able to connect on some sort of other plane. It's almost like with, like the Dead Zone, where Christopher Walken's character, after waking up from a coma, he's had this traumatic experience, but now he has this kind of otherworldly sense or connection to something deeper. And Ellie's a very sensitive soul. And there's also just a clever line at the beginning where, she's dancing around in this newspaper makeshift dress, and she says, oh, who are you wearing? And
Mhm.
I just found that line was kind of interesting because at one point she literally is it's also a little bit of Vertigo in there as well, where she's becoming this other person, but
Yeah.
the idea of like, who are you wearing, and she becomes Sandy as
Yeah, that's
the
cool. Yeah.
the film progresses along. So yeah, there's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff to really admire and like, and it is a fun film. It's just that some of the more substantial social commentary on the past and present, in terms of where we are and how history repeats itself or it doesn't change at all, kind of feels like, this movie maybe can't really dig deeper than just the surface of
Mhm.
that stuff. And it's just a shame because, again, like, a lot of it is so much fun, that it kind of, when you get to the more serious moments, it just doesn't necessarily stick the landing.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that.
And
A
also
couple
shout out to Chancellor Valorum, aka Terrence Stamp,
Sure,
who's
yeah.
also, I think, perfectly cast as a
Yeah.
role of a guy who's, has this distinguished kind of charm to him, but also there's this underlining seediness.
Yeah. You've already touched on the cinematography, so I don't need to go more into that. But I did think like the shots of London with the neon lighting and the puddles in the rain and stuff, it all looked really, really nice. The sound design I think is also excellent. Obviously, the needle drops are great, and literally, again, I could go two ways with this kind of stuff, but Edgar Wright is the guy who can do it properly, where I'm not annoyed that there are like 400 songs in the movie, like
Right.
where in something like Suicide Squad or American Hustle
Or a lot
or
of Tarantino movies or Martin
yeah.
Scorsese films.
But some people do it better than others, right?
Right.
And I think, Scorsese and Tarantino do it a little bit better than some of these other
Well,
movies.
because
And I
they're
think,
curating their
yeah, and Edgar
soundtracks
Wright is in that
themselves.
category as well. But
Yeah.
then to the actual sound design and going back to seeing it at TIFF Bell Lightbox, man, that we saw it in Cinema 3, which doesn't have the Dolby Atmos system. And this is a little in the weeds, but like we saw it at the perfect theater because the projection was amazing, the masking was fantastic, the sound was incredible. I was dead center, which I usually sit a little bit closer, but because we have reserved seating, I was like, oh, I'm like literally dead center in this theater. I probably had one of the best seats there. And it's just the sound design is, I noticed things because the sound was so great at Lightbox that I would have never heard in a multiplex or something like that. Like you mentioned the "Who Are You Wearing" line, which is more obvious, but like there's some whispery kind of sound design through like the ghost that she's kind of encountering and things like that. And like they're just like little things that I kept noticing in the surround sound, and the sound, it was bombastic and loud, and like and that kind of goes into the territory of talking about the scares of the movie. And I don't think the movie's necessarily scary. I don't necessarily think it needs to be scary either, because it is enjoyable and energetic. But there are a couple moments with had this classic kind of very loud noise jump scare kind of thing, and just this bombastic sound at the light
Or
box.
the false sense of
Um,
security where the character
yeah.
thinks that they're okay and then, they're startled by something.
Yeah, which is always fun,
Yeah.
but the movie itself, like there is some creepy design when it comes to certain things that I kind of liked, but then the more you saw of it, the more you're like, okay, I this doesn't, and I know it's playing
It
into
loses its impact after a while because, as you say, like, it's used quite a bit.
which is any classic horror movie thing. The more I see of the monster, the less I kind of think it's scary.
Or less
So
scary.
yeah, the
The
less scary it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah, yeah. Because, but there are certain creatures that, like, if they're really, like, obviously, H.R. Geiger's the alien, like the xenomorph is incredible, and unfortunately that creature design is used so much that it kind of, again, loses its
Yeah.
impact. But yeah, there's just something about it where it's like it works in small doses, and less is always more, because I think the creepier thing is just leaving it to your own imagination.
No, I totally agree. So yeah, I'm torn on it. I could go anywhere as high as a 3.5, but and then there were times where I'm like, I don't know if I quite dug this movie. But then I think I ended up teetering off, and I'm gonna give it a 3 out of 5.
I'm going to give it a 3.5 out of 5. And another quick thing, not that it affects the film, but and we haven't seen it, but we'll probably catch up with it after the festival. I would be really curious to see how it compares to James Wan's *Malignant*, which is also supposedly very much influenced by Giallo cinema. So I would be fascinated to see how they compare and contrast in terms of the influences that they're borrowing from. But if you are interested in Giallo cinema, I mean, the obvious one to start at is Suspiria, not the Luca Guadagnino one, the Dario Argento movie. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you all for listening or watching. We'll be covering, like I mentioned, the entirety of the 2021 Toronto International Film Festival. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube, hit that notification bell, all that jazz. You give us a thumbs up. I think that's a good thing. And then or head over to podcast services at Untitled Movie Reviews. If you want just a one-stop shop for everything, head over to our Letterboxd HQ, which is Untitled_movies. We post all the links to the YouTube videos, the podcast, all of our ratings. So our average of Eric and I's ratings are usually on there. Not usually, they are on there all the time. And everything you want is over there. All the social links, all that jazz. You can find more of my work right here at untitledmoviepodcast.com and around the internet, but you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rorabeck.
And I'm Eric Marchen. You can find more of my video reviews at rogerstv.com/cinemascene, and on the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
Forget all your troubles and go downtown.
Down. We need to go downtown soon to see fucking Dune. All right, bye.